Well, good morning and good afternoon for some. This is Jennifer Joyce. I am the Regional Vice President of Sales for the Western region here at Conducive Technologies, and today we will be talking with you about how we can achieve 2x faster SQL experience, guaranteed. So this webinar today is really broken out into two parts. The first part is, I would just refer to this as the thought leadership portion of the webinar, and that's where we just kind of dig in under the hood a bit, under the technology stack, and what our goal is here is to explain what some of the I/O inefficiencies are that are occurring, and some of the I/O degradation issues that are occurring in the environment if you're running SQL Server, particularly if you virtualize that environment. I just recently came across a SQL environment that wasn't virtualized yet, sitting on a SAN that had 600,000 IOPS on it and an all-flash pure storage that was having problems too, and so we were able to get in there and help them out. So physical or virtual environments, we'll just get in there and see what's happening under the hood, just what's stealing the underlying IOPS and throughput that's causing your underlying storage subsystems to work much harder than they really should be. And ultimately why, if you're on this webinar and experiencing this, you may be getting less performance than you actually should on those SQL workloads. There are some inherent I/O penalties that are occurring, and a couple of them that we're going to bring to light today that we'll talk about, and we'll give that overview for you. And then probably no more than a 10-minute overview of what our software does, how it does that optimization. And then we'll just emphasize here that this is a set and forget software utility, a 100% software solution. It runs in the background on Windows servers. So if you don't have a Windows shop, this isn't for you. But if you do have a Windows shop, then feel free to stay on board here with us for this conversation today. And so this solution is tackling those I/O inefficiencies that we're talking about solving so that we can guarantee, at least for our customers, that 2x faster SQL experience. And obviously, the compelling event about that is that you can get way more performance out of your SQL servers without having to buy more expensive hardware and just throwing more and more hardware at the problem. This is a very unique solution that you're going to be listening to today. It can actually solve that problem, as I mentioned, with a 100% software approach. And we'll be giving you a complimentary NFR, not for resale license. It's more than a $500 MSRP value after the webinar is over for having attended as a thank you. And ultimately, the reason we're doing that is the proof is in the pudding. We want you to go ahead and put this software to the test. And on the line with me is my partner in crime, Howard Butler. And Howard is the Senior Director of Systems Engineering here at Conducive. And for any of you car aficionados out there, if you're ever on a one-on-one call with Howard, not only does he specialize in accelerating performance in computers, but he's also a race car instructor. So he also specializes in accelerating fast cars whenever he gets a chance. So Howard, I'll turn it over to you for a sec here.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Jennifer. Thanks for the great introduction there. And, as you've heard me say many times before, go fast or go home. That's,
that's true.
Pretty much the mantra here. And I hope that during this presentation we'll have an opportunity to speak about how our software really does accelerate the performance of Windows platforms.
That's awesome. Thank you, Howard. So one thing we're going to do while we're going through this webinar is we will be taking, as we can, questions as we go. We also will have a Q&A session at the bottom. Our goal here is to get through the core of the content by the bottom of the hour, and anyone who wants to stick around for the Q&A, which is usually very robust and dynamic, please do. But please start dropping those questions into the Q&A box as the questions come up, because probably if you're thinking it, someone else is thinking it, and you're doing them a favor just dropping that into the box there. We'll take them as we can during the presentation and then do the Q&A session at the bottom of anything we didn't get to. So we'll just jump right in here. Let me see here. Got the controls, but I need to do them correctly. There we go. So, I'm not crazy about it when companies spend a lot of time on the corporate slide, but I'm also not crazy about it if I know nothing about them. We do want to give you some relevant context here, so just a minute on this about what our street cred is. We are actually a 35-year-old software company, and from our research, what we can tell is that we are the 12th oldest software company in the world. We originally started out as a company known as Diskkeeper, and I'm guessing a few of you could raise your hands that you've either heard of us or even used some of our software in the past for hard disk drives. About 5 years ago, though, the company brought some really revolutionary intellectual property into the marketplace. It just has absolutely nothing to do with fragmentation. It was all about how can we reduce and kind of get rid of the noisy I/O, all that noisy and unnecessary I/O, as it turns out. It's unnecessary on any given SQL system where there's between 30 to 40% of I/O traffic, and it's just noise. It's just stealing IOPS and stealing throughput. And in fact, those customers of ours who add just a little bit more memory server side, especially on SQL, most servers don't need it, but on SQL we can tune that up a bit. And to really take advantage of our software, they'll see, up to 50% of their read I/O traffic getting offloaded, served directly from VM and getting offloaded off the storage, and that helps contribute to those faster gains. Now, for this work, Gartner did name us Cool Vendor of the Year. And that was when we launched that into the marketplace about 5 years ago. And we've now had this product in the market for that. It's had very, very nice growth. We are now used by over 2,500 mid-market and large enterprise customers. And variations or pieces of this technology were OEM'd by Samsung, HP, SanDisk. You can see the list there. So if you haven't heard of us, you clearly have heard of them. And this is a big one, Howard. I know that in addition to our close relationship with VMware as a top partner, we also are a certified Microsoft Gold partner. And not too long ago, just a few months ago, I know you were closely involved with this initiative, Microsoft named us as the first ever software vendor certified under their SQL I/O reliability program, and that was a pretty big deal.
You're right, Jennifer. That was a pretty neat elite certification. Microsoft has, certain levels to make sure that other applications like ourselves are fully compatible with their software. So in this case, SQL Server. And as you said, we're one of the only software vendors that has had this certification. And we're in good company with people like EMC, and Dell, HP, and besides all the testing, we also go through a panelist list of SQL experts that we have to kind of pass through to ensure that they feel comfortable with our solution as well. So it's a pretty neat certification and very exclusive one.
Yeah, and I was impressed when we got that too. So we'll kind of move on here real quick, but before we jump right into the thought leadership portion of this, what I'd like to kind of talk about is, let me see here. Yeah, what I'd like to talk about next is kind of painting the picture here of what's happening in the environment and kind of what is this I/O degradation issue that is stealing performance. We did a survey recently. We conducted the survey from over 1,000 IT professionals that responded to us, and one of the questions we asked was, of all the hard-hitting applications that you're running, with SQL and stuff, how many of you would say that you have performance problems so bad that you're actually getting staff or customer complaints due to sluggish performance? Slow queries, slow performance, just batch jobs taking too long, that kind of stuff. And if you look at the graph, you'll see here that 28% of respondents came in and said, yeah, we're raising our hand, we're having that issue. And we've done the same survey the last couple of years, and it's been coming right in the same area. The year before it was 27%, so just a little slow creep up there. And what we did then was we kind of wanted to see, where, with all the respondents that we had, with people saying, the different types of applications that they were having trouble with, we just kind of made a word cloud to visualize what the most frequent answers were. And you can see it here, SQL, Oracle, it's all the, BI, the database kind of stuff is really dragging down performance. So that was another aspect that we kind of drew out of that survey with those respondents. 7 out of 10 talking about SQL being a main area for attention. Now, let me just jump on to this next slide, and I think the setup here was long enough. So let me give you a picture of what we really want to see happening in an environment. This would be what we would consider to be kind of an ideal I/O profile. And we would want our environments to look like this: large sequential reads and writes. This is, obviously a rudimentary extraction of what it looks like to have, kind of the I/O coming down from the Windows operating system. But what you see here is really that nice large contiguous reads and writes, and you're getting a really healthy payload of data with every I/O operation, and you can notice the sequential nature of how this traffic looks as well. So it really would be optimal and how we would want the I/O flowing from server to hypervisor to SAN. What's actually happening, though, is this. When left to its own devices, Windows will behave like this and kind of inflict this really messy I/O pattern on the environment. I think you can see the immediate takeaway there. So suddenly now in this environment, there's these I/O characteristics that are much smaller, they're much more fractured, they're more random than they need to be. I mean, you could just call this a death by a thousand cuts kind of scenario, where your underlying architecture is just processing workloads, but ultimately having to really sweat and work much harder than it needs to. It'd be kind of like pouring molasses all over your flash storage or your hybrid storage, your disk storage, because now that you're penalizing the storage performance with all of that, what we refer to as the perfect trifecta for bad storage performance: small, fractured, and randomized I/O characteristics is just tough to process. Now, if we dig in under the hood and we see what's actually going on and what's causing this, we can see that there's actually two different what we call I/O penalties that are occurring, and you can kind of see these called out on the slide here. The first one at the bottom here, I'm going to focus on that first, is called the I/O blunder effect. Now, the I/O blunder effect, it's likely that you've heard this term. It's a term that we helped Gartner coin about 5 years ago when we were really coming into this marketplace with this product, and virtualization was really upticking and spreading across the landscape. It's what happens the moment you virtualize more than one server and you put more than one server on that host hypervisor, or in a physical environment where you have more than a one-to-one relationship from physical server to storage. For example, the guys that I just spoke with last week, they finished their evaluation of the software on these 12 physical servers, all attached to this pure SAN storage, all flash with 600,000 IOPS. On one of their workloads on their data warehouse, we were able to shave a full 4 hours off of that data warehouse processing. It was starting at 9 p.m., finishing at 4 a.m., and their window shut off at 5, so they still had an hour buffer, but when we were able to take 4 hours off, it now finished at midnight. And gave them all that room back to grow back into. And obviously they weren't using 600,000 IOPS. It wasn't that. That wasn't the issue. It was the inefficiency coming from Windows and really dragging things down. It's just swamping the hardware with this I/O. It just couldn't process it. It was queuing and things like that. So there's really no fix in the hardware stacks for what's happening and what's being generated by the Windows operating system. One of the things that's kind of tricky about this is that most organizations don't see the full performance penalty that comes with virtualization, and that one of the reasons for that is they don't notice it is because, it's one, virtualization adds complexity to the data path, and two, they tend to virtualize slowly over time. So it's kind of this slow creep of degradation that it's kind of like, well, it's always been that way kind of feel, and it's kind of like when you get into the car, you keep turning the volume up on the radio a little louder, a little louder, a little louder. You don't realize how loud it is. Next time you get in the car, you get blasted out. That's kind of how this performance degradation creeps up on people, and they don't realize how bad it is over time. But where it's real noticeable is when someone does flip the switch on a full PV on thousands of servers at the same time, and we actually had that happen. One of our customers, Chris's study, we just actually even refreshed their case study. Chris's Health is one of the top 10 largest healthcare providers in the United States. They're located out of Texas, and they did flip the switch. They virtualized one environment with over 2,000 VMs overnight, basically. And Howard, I think you were involved in that to a large degree, and you might have some insight into that event and kind of how that rolled out.
I did, and as you mentioned, they did a lot of their testing on individual systems, and they expected that when they went from a physical to a virtual platform, that they get the same kind of performance. But when they did virtualize all those systems, unfortunately, they didn't get the same kind of performance that they were expecting. They definitely saw that degradation that you spoke about. And during their analysis, what they found was that the problem wasn't CPU related, it wasn't memory, but what it ultimately became, or what they realized, was that it was an I/O bottleneck issue. And that's what caused most of the issues there. And their first reaction was, well, we're going to upgrade our storage. And in doing so, they were looking at an all-flash array to solve this type of problem. But before they actually did that, they got an evaluation copy of our software, and I worked with them, and we did some testing, matching up workloads and things like that. And that's what really resolved their bottleneck issue. So rather than them spending $2 million for an all-new flash storage array, we were able to save them that just for a fraction of the cost of our software.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one too. And you check out the case study, they actually had a purchase order sitting there ready to be signed for that hardware, and when they finished our POC, they actually canceled the order. And it's not our goal to displace hardware. If you need hardware, you need hardware, but if you don't, you don't. And this is a really good idea to look at what's happening with the operating system to see if that could be a root cause. And sometimes it's a game of inches. You got to turn a knob here and turn a knob here, and this is a really important knob to turn to help make that forward progress. So as difficult as the I/O blender effect penalty is, there's another penalty that's a little further upstream at the top of the stack. This is what I was alluding to earlier. It's the Windows operating system itself. And seen many jokes on Windows works, is the punchline of it. So now you may be joining. I don't know if you joined the call a little late or not. I had mentioned earlier that our company had rebranded. I've seen people join since I mentioned this, so I'll just repeat this real quick. We were formerly Diskkeeper Corporation, so you may have heard me allude to kind of some operating system type level stuff we used to do in the past. But right now what we're doing, and that legacy and that history gives us that long-term expertise to be able to solve this issue. In fact, we are one of just a handful of companies in the world that have ever had access to the Microsoft operating system source code. So that gives us a lot of the knowledge of what our engineers are able to do here. But the simple fact is that the Windows operating system simply doesn't really play well in a virtual environment, and it doesn't play well in any environment where it's extracted from the physical layer. And there's some really severe inefficiencies in the handoff of data between the Windows operating system and underlying storage, and no one's really talking about that, I think, except us. There are no APIs that can connect Windows other than using the rudimentary framework that Windows already has to send data down to the storage. The Windows operating system for any given file that should be written in red with just 1 or 2 or 3 IOs, just a minimal number of operations, Windows ultimately takes that file and breaks it down into much, much, much smaller pieces than it actually needs to be, and many more pieces than it needs to be. And ultimately what happens is you end up in a situation where you're processing 4 IOs where you should have been processing 1. So Howard, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what's actually happening here and why Windows is so inefficient with the handoff of that data.
Well, as you kind of mentioned there, Windows, the NTFS file system, truly does take kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, Jennifer. And when the file is getting created or extended or modified, the file system really doesn't know at that point in time how large that file is ultimately going to be. So what it does is that on the logical side of things, not talking directly at the physical storage level, but the behavior of the file system is an abstract of the physical storage side of things. And what it's doing is it's looking for the next fixed allocation. And what I mean by that is Windows isn't spending any time looking for the best possible fit. So if the next available segment of free space is only 4 KB in size, but the application you're running is saying it wants to write a megabyte of data, you can't put a megabyte of data into such a small section of free space. But what Windows will do is write what it can into that 4 KB section and then go and look for the next free space. Well, what if it too is also 4 KB in size? And you kind of rinse and repeat that same process over and over again until you've written all the data. The downside to all of that is you're incurring a huge I/O penalty. Extra IOs are issued because of those small individual writes. And then however you've written the data is how it's going to be read back. So you're taking a penalty both on writes and on reads because of that behavior of the file system.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Howard. And another point to kind of add on to that is that if you're ever looking at storage benchmarks, they really kind of give you two. They give you random I/O and sequential I/O, and you'll always notice that the sequential I/O is always outperforming the random I/O. So what we're also trying to do with our solution, Howard, as you're talking about all that breakup of files and not having the right size allocations, if we can help provide those right size allocations, we're basically enforcing the Windows operating system to do these nice sequential I/Os, and you're going to have a much better experience out of the software that we were looking at on the previous slide.
Absolutely true.
So, another good example of this is another case study that we published recently, and that was the University of Illinois. And I haven't advanced this slide in case anyone's wondering, just making sure you know that. But with the University of Illinois, their hardest hitting databases and their applications were actually Oracle. And they also had some SQL as well. And you probably notice I'm not talking just about SQL here. While SQL is a sweet spot, this applies to any application running in Windows because our solution is really optimizing Windows, kind of making the point here that Windows is the weak link. Applications are kind of victims to how Windows is organizing and handling the data as you see on this slide here. So, at the University of Illinois, they were already running those databases on the latest Dell servers. They had upgraded and put in an all-flash compellent SAN. They had, everything on day one was running just fine, but about a year in, performance had degraded so bad that they thought they were going to have to add more arrays on, not for capacity, but just for, IOPS to meet their end user SLAs. So before they did that, they came, in their research for solutions, they came across us and saw that the evaluation was free, nothing to risk, so they installed it, and it more than doubled their performance in that environment on top of those all-flash arrays. So they were pretty astounded, as are a lot of our customers, like the story I just told you about on the POC I finished up last week. In fact, I had a couple of those last week that went kind of similar to that. So it's, it's interesting as well as we kind of advance here down the slide stack. And I want to start encouraging anyone to start dropping questions into the Q&A box because we are going to be coming up to the Q&A section here real quick. So any technical questions, anything that you guys have on mind, licensing, anything like that, go ahead and start dropping those in so that we've got that to grab when we get to the Q&A section. So talking a little bit about the solution, I mentioned that Howard and I would both just give a real quick overview of what the software does to resolve the problems that we just talked about and how we handle that handoff of and then how Windows can enhance its handoff of I/O. And then also, when we get down to the bottom of the hour here, when we start the Q&A portion, we'll also be talking about the handoff of the NFR to you guys to make sure you have the software. It's really seamless to install. It takes about 5 minutes to install in your environment, so you can start seeing the improvements right away. No reboot is required when you install this. It's literally a fire and forget it. Also, another question that comes up a lot is, hey, what's the overhead for this? Where do you install it? So it installs right into the Windows operating system. It's a very thin filter driver. It's just nominal overhead. We call it near zero overhead impact. And we would challenge you to even see the CPU footprint. It's enormously lightweight. And the CPU resources that it does use not only runs at lowest priority, but also has algorithms to monitor that we can get completely out of the way. I guess you could call us, we're the last to the party and the first to leave when it comes to using any resources in the environment. And so what the software is doing is actually offloading the I/O. And I'm going to explain to you the two patented engines that's in the software that you should be aware of and what we're doing. So the first engine that I'm going to talk about is our write I/O reduction engine. So this one is called IntelliWrite. And this is really interesting because this is where we come in and we handle write optimization. And Howard alluded to this earlier. He mentioned that however it writes is how it reads. So if it writes messy, it's going to read back messy. If it writes clean, it's going to read clean. Now, Howard, maybe you could just touch on this just a little bit of what we're doing with this optimization work here.
Sure. So with our filter driver there, as I mentioned before, instead of letting Windows haphazardly allocate these small, tiny little writes, we have the ability to provide to Windows the necessary information that it needs to know where are the larger chunks of available free space. and can pass that information back to Windows such that the file system then can allocate a larger section of space for writing the data that it needs, so it doesn't break it up into these little tiny fractured writes. So it's really, Windows is still doing the I/O operation. We're just providing some enhanced intelligence back to Windows so it can do it more efficiently.
Yeah, and and Howard, as time goes on and files are written and erased, rewritten and extended, that's where the issue of that degradation and that breakdown starts occurring. And we'll just paint one example here, kind of, Howard, as you mentioned earlier, just kind of breaking files up. If you're trying to write that 64K file and the next space is only 4K, it's going to use it. Split, find the next allocation. If it's 4K, it's going to use it, and that's how you start getting excess I/O for the same amount of work. So again, I see people dropping questions in the box now. Please keep bringing those in. Those are great questions. I got a chance to scan them just real quick, and we'll get to those very shortly. But I think we should go ahead and Howard, unless you had anything else you wanted to add on to IntelliWrite, I'll go ahead and go on to the next engine.
No, let's continue on.
Okay, great. So, going into the next engine, and I'm sorry, it didn't advance. I hit the wrong button, guys. Thanks for bearing with me. All right, there it is. There it is. All right. So what we're looking at here is the second core engine that I wanted to touch on, and this is IntelliMemory. And this is pretty important here because, the intelligence that we're feeding into the write optimization, if we've got the right size, it writes clean, it reads clean, we remove 30% of the I/O from that engine. Now, this next engine is actually a DRAM read caching engine, and that's where we're establishing what we like to call a tier 0 caching strategy. So if you've got hybrid storage, you've already got a tier 1 layer down below. But we're going to just tap into the DRAM resource here. It's just idle, free, available memory sitting at the server that's doing nothing. It's not only one of the cheapest components of your environment, it's also the fastest. It's 10 to 15 times faster than going down to the tier 1 flash. So this tier 0 caching strategy just leverages that. And the real genius of the engine is that it is completely automatic. You don't have to get in there and turn any knobs. You don't have to carve out or allocate any memory for cache, and the software is aware moment by moment just of how much memory is unused on that server at any time, how much it can borrow. And this is a really good place where I say, we're the last to arrive at the party and the first to leave. It's a dynamic allocation of memory. So if it's needed by something else, we get the heck out of the way. If it's sitting there free and available, we can get in there and use it to serve hot reads. And we're really judicious about what we put in there. So not only is it dynamic and it doesn't permanently reserve in the memory, it also is you don't need a lot of memory to do this. It only is going for the hot logical data blocks that are repetitively read. And if it doesn't meet that criteria, it's not going to be in there. So it's not an inefficient FIFO kind of cache. It's, hey, what's the data that actually needs to be in here? And it'll prefetch that, have that populated and waiting. So, obviously, if, like as I was mentioning, if you're under a heavy workload, you're memory constrained, you're at peak, well, we're just going to sit idle and we're going to give all that memory back. But if you've got a little bit of room in there, we can play and we can offload a lot of I/O. It makes a big difference. So, Howard, we found that customers who maintain, people are probably wondering how much memory, right? What we found is that customers who have just about 4 gigs of memory on most systems, that's going to do just fine. On the really big, and we're talking to the SQL audience here today, so on the really big, heavy SQL servers, you probably have a lot of memory on some of those really big ones, 264 gigs or whatever. We'd probably play with more if you've got a lot of read traffic on those. But on just your everyday run-of-the-mill average Windows server, 4 to 6 gigs of free memory that's probably already on the system is going to be more than sufficient. And we can turn a couple knobs on the big SQLs if we need to. Howard, maybe I'll just kind of come over to you for any other thoughts you want to add on to the IntelliMemory engines.
Well, you're right. There are 2 things that kind of stand out in mind here, with our IntelliMemory caching, and it's the fact that 9 out of the 10 top PC manufacturers do license our technology, and wouldn't have heard of us being licensed in there simply because they have it under their own name there. But it is something that's extremely important and that they consider quite valuable. And another part too is that there's quite a bit of intelligence wrapped around what we decide to place into the cache. You know, it's not just a first in, first out, or least frequently used type of approach, but having heuristic data about the behavior of your applications, the things that are being done right here, right now, at this very second in time. Based upon that information, knowing what the hot data blocks are for read access are the ones we want to populate and keep in the cache. So we're actually monitoring kind of what's happening in the background to have a very sophisticated cache using the least amount of memory to obtain those results.
Yep. So, you know, it's interesting too, because if you are a Gartner client, you can check in with them as well. And you know, they've called us the world leader in DRAM caching technology. We can't say, you know for sure that we are, but we believe we've sold more caching licenses than any other player in the marketplace over the years. So just let me outline a couple of these real-world use cases, and the questions are coming in still, and they're very good questions. We'll get to those in just a moment, so please drop any more in that you have that you're thinking about. I'll just outline a couple of these real-world case studies here, and all of these are on our website. But, you know, if I'm taking a look here, like right in the middle of the screen at ASL Marketing, they had a huge impact on their batch import jobs. It had millions of records, and it would take 27 hours to complete. And when I spoke with them, that was a call center, and they needed that data imported sooner than 27 hours because we literally had data not in the database, and people would call back out to the same accounts because the data from the day before wasn't in time. They just didn't have the budget to rip and replace their hybrid storage with all flash, so they tried our software, and we cut that down to 27 hours down to 12. So that was pretty, you know, jaw-dropping. Another example, Stockport College, they were actually, their servers were crashing on enrollment day. It was taking them an average of 15 minutes to just process one student record trying to enroll. And another situation, didn't have the budget to rip and replace, and they went ahead and dropped us in, and that 15-minute average went down to 5 minutes and got them back into meeting their SLAs. And that worked so well for them that they actually went over to some Crystal reports. They had some long-running payroll batch jobs, put us on there, and that was taking an hour and a half, and it brought it down to 10 minutes. So it was really, really interesting. And, you know, on this next slide here, there's a couple more case studies that you can look at, but a good example, Alvernia University, they had 3,000 students. They were accessing an LMS package. They were also taking online tests that were timing out during the test due to I/O demands. That's not acceptable. And can you imagine you being that student, like you're in the middle of the flow and boom, timeout. So without the budget to rip and replace their back-end architecture, they tried our software, doubled their performance, and the timeout stopped, and got the job done. So we'll just take a quick look here at the UI of the software. And you can see here, it shows you total IOs eliminated. This is really in our sweet spot. Write IOs eliminated, we typically see about 30% on average, write IOs eliminated. Read IOs eliminated usually sits around 50% on average. You can see here in this screenshot, this was a production system that we got a screenshot of over a 3-week average. They were sitting at 64%. So some pretty nice looking numbers here. So you know, how do we get this to you? This is where we're going to talk about the handoff of the NFRs to you and kind of our best practices. So as soon as the webinar ends, our marketing team will be working hard to send you your NFRs so that you can start installing the software in your environment. Now, this part I'm going to talk about may end up answering a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A box that I've seen come in, but this is pretty important. So on a SQL server, I did see one question from Andrew that said, what if SQL is set to use 100% of available memory? Well, we're simply not going to cache. You'll get the write optimization benefit. There's no memory requirement for that. There's no buffering going on with the writes at all. The caching is 100% on read cache, so you'll still get the benefit there. But if you do have SQL set at 100% use of available memory, we would recommend that you consider setting a limit on SQL, and you could go one of two directions. Let's say you had 64 gigs sitting on that server. You could then set the limit down at 48 or 52 or something like that, leave some memory free for us to play with. Or if you're not comfortable with that, you'd rather leave the allocation where it is, go ahead and leave it where it is, place a memory limit in place of how much SQL is natively using, and then add memory on top of that. Keep in mind, if you've rebooted that server, it's going to kind of throw things off because the SQL cache will need to rebuild. So you kind of want to make sure that SQL, you really know how much SQL is using if you're going to go that route. But we have found that by taking and reallocating memory to velocity, because we use the memory so much more efficiently than SQL does, that it tends to give a much better boost to, if you're going to use the existing allocations, it gives a much better boost to lend some of that over to velocity. So the third step being then monitor the velocity dashboard. So, and when it says add more DRAM if possible, that's going to be, again, if you need it. Most servers already have plenty. I just did an assessment with someone the other day. We got in their environment. They've finished their deployments on 100 VMs. And we in our console, you can really clearly see at a glance which VMs, it's color-coded even, yellow and red. Hey, these VMs could use a little more memory. And out of 100 servers, there were 3 that we recommended adding a little bit more memory to, and it was like 2 or 4 gigs each. So what you already have on your servers is probably enough. On the big SQL servers, you probably have enough, but you want to consider putting that memory limit in place. On step 3, monitoring the velocity dashboard, you want to wait about a week. So after you've got it in there, you pop into that dashboard about a week later, you'll see the I/O offload numbers, what we've been able to eliminate, and also there's a tab in there that will show us how much of the memory we're using for cache. And hey, if you haven't limited SQL memory, it's probably going to be 0, just a heads up. So the next steps here are we're going to have you download and install the NFR and then monitor the dashboard. You also have an alternative option. I'm going to kind of come back to the story that just happened to me last week with these guys I mentioned with the 12 physical servers and sitting on that 600,000 IOPS pure flash SAN. How that POC rolled out was they said, well, no, we just want to start on the data warehouse server. And I said, fine, no problem, but I will let you know that, remember we talked about those 2 I/O penalties. We had the Windows I/O inefficiency, the Windows I/O tax, but we also had the I/O blender effect. Even though these guys weren't virtualized, they still had the I/O blender effect because they had all these physical servers attached to the same SAN. And I said, if you do not see the results by deploying just to your data warehouse server, will you agree to go ahead and deploy to all 12 VMs hooked into that SAN? And they said, well, it's going to take us some change control, but yes, we will. So because of the change control, there was a little delay, but they did that. They deployed on the data warehouse server, no results. They got the change control, then they deployed to all 12 VMs, and that's when we had the call. Actually, the call was on Halloween. They got on the phone and told me the results of the 4 hours getting shaved off. And I said, well, it is Halloween. Is this trick or treat? And they said, no, it's treat, and we're putting in for our PO. So that I/O blender effect cannot be underestimated. So that's why we also provide you with a 30-day trial to put it across all of the VMs on the same host or all of the servers attached to that same back-end physical storage. I've had people do POCs in multiple phases where they actually ended up deploying to 200 VMs during the POC. Not necessarily recommending it. We don't need to make a science project of testing, but sometimes they want to see really, hey, before I spend my money on this product, what's it really going to do for me? And we encourage that. We want you to you know, the software does come with a money-back guarantee, a full money-back guarantee, but you don't need to spend your money first. Just do the full evaluation, kick the tires, use the software. If you get the results, then make the investment. So at this point, that's the content. We do realize that people may need to drop off the call to get to other obligations. The webinar is recorded. We're going to go into the Q&A session portion of this right now. So if you do have to drop off at any time, you will be sent a recording. You can listen to the Q&A session after the fact. But we are going to go ahead and start jumping into some of these questions here that we haven't gotten to yet. And the first question, well, it's really a statement from the user that logged in as ICS, hello, we've been using DiskKeeper for 20 plus years. Thank you for all the great products over the years. You're welcome. And I can say you're welcome for about 10 of those years. Howard's got the whole 20 plus years covered. Is this a separate software offering than SSD Keeper, or does SSD Keeper provide the I/O reduction as well for SQL? SSD Keeper is focused on the desktop side. So all of these solutions, everything that I just spoke about today with all of our technology is in SSD Keeper. It is designed for optimizing the desktop solution that has SSDs in it, and V-locity has the same technology under the hood. So if you peel back what's in V-locity and what's in SSD Keeper, we actually developed and R&D'd all of this in the V-locity platform, perfected it there, and then we introduced it into SSD Keeper. So they are overlapping technologies. You would use one or the other. They both get you the same optimization. The next question here is, so do I install on the Hyper-V host or the SQL guest? You're going to install on the SQL guest, and I'll touch on the Hyper-V host here for just a second. Howard, if you don't mind, do you want to answer this one, Howard, or should I just roll with that one?
You're on a roll, so keep going.
All right. So while you technically can install on the Hyper-V host because it is Windows-based, we have done a lot of deployments in the past where we tried it on both the VM and the host, and at this point in time the VHD files are not experiencing enough of a degradation, and caching repetitive read traffic from the VHD is not providing enough of a benefit to duplicate and install at both levels. So at this point in time, you would only need to install it on the SQL guest to get your most optimization. You can skip the host. And that answers the next question for Jonathan as well. And also, of course, VMware, it's not even the Windows, kernel there, so there's nothing to install. But yeah, you're just going to focus exactly on installing on the VMs. The next question down is V-locity only for database files, or does it work with other file types? So Howard, I'll punt this one over to you.
So it works across the board. From our perspective, IOs are IOs are IOs, regardless of whether they're being generated by an application that's accessing data in a database or a data store, or it's a Word document or a spreadsheet. IO traffic is IO traffic, and we're going to help reduce or eliminate IOs across the board, regardless of the type of application or storage that's involved. So think of our solution set as focused on improving the inefficiencies within Windows and being application and hardware agnostic.
Thanks, Howard. So the next question is from ICS again, and it's how well does the technology improve performance on RAM-restricted machines? We've noticed excellent performance increases on servers with 128 gig to 1 terabyte of RAM, but have been hesitant to install on servers with low amounts of RAM of 16 to 64 gigs particularly. Works great. We've installed, in fact, most of the servers we install on have 8 to 16 gigs. So even the ones that you're hesitant to install on are on the lower side. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'll really kind of emphasize this key point, is that as I said, we're the last to the party and the first to leave when it comes to that RAM utilization. So if the RAM is not free, we simply will be completely hands off. And if we're installed and it's needed, we get out of the swimming pool real quick. And one of the things that we do is that we actually leave a minimum reserved allocation completely untouched. It has to be completely free at all times before we'll even start building a cache. And that can range anywhere from 1.5 gigs to 4 gigs depending on the server. So for example, on a 64 gig server, 4 gigs of memory has to be free at all times. So if we're sitting there building up a cache and we see there's 4 gigs left, we'll stop. And if that 4 gigs shrinks, goes down to 3.5 gigs, we'll release memory and keep that 4 gigs always there. So you're never going to run into a memory starvation situation. We are checking that every second, and we release large chunks of RAM so that you're never going to have a memory contention, that we're just really leveraging correctly the resource that's there, free, available, idle, and taking the hands off instantaneously so that it's there for other processes that may need it. So we're very, very, very comfortable in the lower RAM systems, and if the room's not there to play, simply sits idle. Next question we've already answered from Andrew during the middle of the presentation. For Charles, if I needed to uninstall it because it didn't work out for any reason in my environment, does it completely uninstall, no remnants, without rebooting Q? So Howard, I'll tap you for this one, please.
That's one of the newer great technologies we've added into the product, is a no reboot necessary for both installing the product as well as uninstalling the product. And it does completely remove the product from the platform there. So you're in good shape. I don't anticipate you would even have a need to uninstall, but it's there just in case you do.
Thank you, Howard. And so we got about 4 or 5 questions left. When we get to the bottom of the list and there are no more questions, we will end off the call. So if you have any questions you haven't popped into the Q&A chat box yet, please do, and we'll make sure we get to those before we end off. So it says here, Howard, this one would be for you. What is the minimum version of SQL needed to utilize the software?
You know, kind of rolling back to one of my previous answers, there's really not a requirement of a particular SQL version. It really is based on the version of the operating system. So we support Windows 2008 R2 in newer versions of Windows. And then whatever version of SQL you're running within that operating system platform, we fully support.
That's great. Patrick asks a question, what is the cost and how is this licensed? Is this per processor, per server? How is it done, right? So this is licensed two ways. You can license it by VM or server. So if it's a physical server like the guys I was telling you the story about, they're getting 12 licenses for those 12 servers because there is no host. If you had a server farm that had 300 VMs in it and there were 10 servers you cared about, then you would just buy 10 server licenses, and you know, they're vMotioning, they're live migrating, whatever. It doesn't matter because just those 10 VMs are licensed. If you want to really take that I/O blender effect seriously, and no matter what the workload is, and you say to yourself, you know, I want to remove 30 to 50% of all of my I/O collectively from all my VMs from hitting my backend storage, kind of because that's when the magic happens, then you can license by host. And we license it by dual socket host or quad socket host, and there is a sliding scale discount. When you license by host, you're not installing on the host, but you gain the right to install on all eligible Windows VMs, and that would be 2008 R2 or higher. And also this is a wonderful solution for VDI. We have a lot of clients who also use this on their Citrix publications, that type of thing. So again, it's by host, and everything on those hosts you can deploy it to. So if you've got, you know, a density of 100 VDI clients sitting on a host, go for it. It's you can deploy it to all of them. As far as pricing, Patrick, I would encourage you to, what we'll do is we'll have your salesperson get in touch with you, because since it is sliding scale, if you're talking about one server or 500 servers or one host or 50 hosts, the price per license goes down significantly as you get into the larger volume. So we'll get that to you offline. Same for anybody else who's curious about pricing. Just let us know what your environment is. We'll give you a customized quote. And Patrick's got another question here. Thank you for the questions. Can I install on a test server to prove and then install on a production server next with the NFR software we are getting? So, you know, what I would recommend that you do is, rather than, and I recommend this to everyone, and actually this could be something that you guys could start throwing into the chat box as well if you want to raise your hand for this. The NFR license is one copy to be permanently installed on a server. It's our gift to you, a thank you and a complimentary gift for attending the webinar and to be able to kick the tires. So if you want to figure out what one server you want to dedicate that free license to, you have a couple of options. One, you can use our conducive I/O assessment tool, which I really like. It's a free analytics assessment tool that you can scan your whole environment with to even see if your servers are candidates for our software. It really shows up the I/O and efficiency nicely. And two is this other recommendation on the slide that's still up, is use the 30-day evaluation. Just use trialware. Don't burn up that NFR free copy. Use the trialware, and once your trial's done, you know, decide what server you want to dedicate that license to and apply the license to that one server at that time. So the evaluation is going to give you a lot of flexibility, and plus it'll really give you that feel and flavor of, you know, the I/O blender effect by putting it on as many VMs as you can in your environment. And then Andrew's got a question. Is there any auto-tuning? Oh, so my comment, by the way, about putting your name in the box is if you would like your sales contact to send you the evaluation version that includes the Velocity Management Console, which is included in the product for free when you purchase it, and have a broader experience on your evaluation, just go ahead and drop your name and then just say, you know, just put in the 30-day trialware with VMC or 30-day trial in the chat box, and we'll make sure we catch that and get that to you today so you don't have to wait. So then Andrew says, is there any auto-tuning to monitor and adjust RAM allocation to optimal I/O reduction? So Howard, I'll turn this over to you.
You know, there is quite a bit of auto-tuning that the application or the product does. It only would utilize memory that's going to be free and available, that's not being used by other applications. So why not go ahead and allow us to put that memory to good use? And as Jennifer had mentioned, it does recognize when that memory may be needed elsewhere, and we'll release memory from our cache and give that memory back to Windows, so applications, never see any type of memory starvation or memory shortfall. In terms of adding more memory, there's also some internal, I don't want to really say diagnostics, but reference points where it will tell you whether or not we believe that we're underperforming because of the lack of available free memory. And that would be your indication to add more memory to that machine. I would start out with 4 gigs or 8 gigs and see the improvement that you're getting and so forth. Larger, more robust servers obviously could use more memory because you're accessing more data.
Okay, great. And almost everybody who logged into the webinar is still with us, and we'll wrap up the Q&A here by the top of the hour. So if, keep hanging with us. We'll be just a couple more minutes here. If you have to drop off, we do understand. So the next question from Patrick is, do you work in a VMware environment? Absolutely. You don't need to install in the VMware hosts, but all of those Windows guests within that VMware context. In fact, 95% of our customers are running us on VMware. If not more. Very, very few Hyper-V, as it just kind of reflects the ratio in the environment. And 90% of the market uses VMware, so that's where we live. Does it help? This is for you, Howard. Does it help website performance like IIS? Absolutely, it does. Okay, great. Question from Andrew. Some of our servers are Azure VMs. Is there any benefit to running Velocity in that environment? And Howard, I don't mind answering that one unless you want to take that one. No, go right ahead. Okay, fair enough. So yes, the answer is yes, there is benefit to running Velocity in that environment. And this is a really good question because it gives us some insight into where we're installed. We are installed directly in the Windows operating system within that server, and we are fenced by Windows. So whether that server is physical or virtual in your own data center or virtual in the public cloud, the same inefficiencies follow it around, and the same optimization that we can provide helps. And what we've heard from our customers who are using us in Azure is, and various other cloud space, Rackspace or wherever they might be, AWS or wherever they might be hosted, is that one, they don't always pay for the fastest disk, right? So instead of paying for all flash for all of their workloads, they're able to couple Velocity in onto those VMs and get flash-like performance on the slower disks, reducing their costs, their hosting costs. And sometimes you don't know if you're on the same hardware with others, so you're being impacted by that I/O blender effect. You can take matters into your own hands by removing and reducing the I/O inefficiencies on your own VMs. So it is very relevant. And in fact, Howard, wasn't the SQL I/O reliability testing that we got done, wasn't that tested in Azure? Yes, it was. That was one of the things I was going to reemphasize and mention. Yeah. So yes, very, very relevant. From Charles, we have a question. And Howard, I'll read this one off for you. My SQL VM is running WS2, it's 2000, I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. What is WS2K8? 2008 R2. I have allocated the full amount of 32 gigs of RAM to this machine due to MS limitations of 32 gigs for the server version. So does this mean that I have to limit SQL to less than 32 gigs in order to free up RAM? If you're letting SQL use all the memory that you have in that machine, if you wish to take advantage of our IntelliMemory data caching, the recaching part of our technology set, then yes, you would need to set a lower maximum limit for SQL. And one of the reasons why that's a good thing to do is because SQL in itself is not all that efficient when it comes to memory utilization. They're kind of operating in this little vacuum where they think they know all the I/O traffic associated to SQL. And they probably do, but they don't see or recognize the I/O traffic from other processes that are also equally generating a tremendous amount of I/O traffic, and that is something that we can help reduce I/O traffic from. And the net result is you get more throughput, faster access to your data, with a little bit of memory being used by Velocity for its IntelliMemory read caching. Thank you, Howard. So we've got a couple last things here before we tie off. So how do I download the NFR version? Will I get an email with a link or something? Yes. Our marketing team will be personally emailing you out your NFR version. Check your spam filter. You'll be receiving that today. If you don't get it, let us know. And we've got a couple people who said yes to the 30-day trial. Cindy, yes, it is recorded, and we will be sure to send you a recording. And let me just check the private Q&A box and see if there's anything there. We're good. Howard, I don't see any other questions in my Q&A box. Do you have any questions in your Q&A box that maybe someone sent you privately?
I didn't see any, so I think we're good.
I think we're good, guys. So we really, really appreciate everyone logging in, and I'd say 90% of the people are still on the call that were here. Really appreciate it. We're looking forward to helping you with your free copies, your assessments, your evaluations, and getting you the software that you would like to help you with any of the issues or performance IO issues that you may be looking to solve in your environment. So again, thank you for your attendance today, and if you did think of any last-minute questions, go ahead and email them back into our team. And yes, Patrick, we will send you the IO assessment tool. Anyone else who wants the IO assessment tool, we'll leave this webinar open for just a moment so that it doesn't close down on you. If you want the IO assessment tool, just drop in IOAT, and we'll make sure we get a copy of that to you as well. All right, that's a wrap. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here as always. Have a wonderful day.